Hey, it's Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up with Unit 11, the Cold War, and we're going to talk a little bit about, some of the practice questions, of course, and the unit focus questions that have come along, of course, with this particular chapter. So what we're going to start with today is we're going to look at the unit focus question. Now, we've talked about that unit focus question every time that we've looked at a lesson. And one of the things that we've preached to you is that we're not going to answer that question. We're not going to answer that question until the very end. Well, today is the very end. And what we're going to do is look at these two questions that deal with the Cold War in the 1950s. What effect did the Cold War have on the United States and its relationship with other nations around the world? And then describe American prosperity during the post-World War II period. Well, when you think about those two particular things now, we've given you a lot of food for thought. And when you think about what effect did the United States have on its relationship with other nations around the world, the United States of America reached out to the nations, of course, that served its interests, and the ones that didn't serve its interests, we did what we could, of course, to undermine them as much as we could, of course, and keep an advantage against the Soviet Union, those Eastern Bloc nations. So, but to make a long story short, what we'll do is we'll flash these particular answers up there and go through each individual one. All right, the first question says, what effect did the Cold War have on the United States in relationship with other nations around the world? Americans were fearful of atomic and nuclear Armageddon and created public service announcements about bomb safety like duck and cover, built bomb shelters in their backyards, and suspected their neighbors of being communists. It was a time of fear and mistrust, and the U.S. took a us against them approach to foreign policy by aligning itself with anti-communist nations regardless of whether or not they were good to their citizens. In other words, this here. The United States of America, in terms of relationships with the rest of the world, we would do what we had to do. If that meant that we had to cozy up to dictators, that's what we did in order to prevent the spread of communism. So when we look at those other countries around the rest of the world in terms of how do we treat them, we treated them based on our own self-interest. What could they do, of course, to help us prevent the spread of communism, of course, into our spheres of influence? So if that meant, supporting Chiang Kai-shek in nationalist China, if that meant doing whatever we had to do to ingratiate ourselves with other nations that had the same interests that we did, that's what we did in opposition to the Soviet Union. The second question is describe American prosperity during the post-World War II period. For American blue-collar workers tied to unions, white-collar workers and their upper class there was great prosperity. For inner-city residents, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native American prosperity skipped them. So what we can tell you is this here. Prosperity, in most cases, were tied to opportunity and access. And, as we said, the white middle class, of course, and white upper class did quite well. But if you were a poor white person, if you were from a disadvantaged community, in most cases, the prosperity skipped you. That didn't mean it skipped everyone, because it did. There were some people, of course, that made out very, very well during the 1950s that were minorities. But for the most part, most Americans who had success were from the white middle class and the white upper class. All right, what we're going to do is look at some practice questions, of course, that deal with the Cold War in Unit 11. These are some of the questions that you should be very familiar with going forward, because these are some of the questions that may show up, of course, on your benchmark test, but they also may show up, of course, on the state assessment that you'll take, of course, in the spring. During Dwight Eisenhower's administration, brinkmanship became the policy of the United States. The strategy of brinkmanship meant that the United States was willing to commit to all-out war to contain communism. People in the United States were prepared for a nuclear conflict. How did President Eisenhower's support of brinkmanship affect society in the United States? A, media appearances by political leaders were limited. B, government funding for science education was expanded. C, immigrant laborers found advancement in the workplace to be difficult. Minority groups found discrimination in the workplace to be widespread. So how did President Eisenhower's support of brinkmanship affect society in the United States? Well, the best answer is government funding for science and education was expanded. Because remember now, one of the things that we thought that because Sputnik was launched from the Soviet Union, the first artificial satellite, we thought that we were behind them, and we had to do what we could, of course, to make sure that we expanded math and science in America so that we could win the space race. Practice question, how did the United States respond to the 1949 communist takeover of China? A, by supporting the North Vietnamese government of Ho Chi Minh, by recognizing Chiang Kai-shek's government in exile in Taiwan, by declaring war on the government of Mao Zedong, by sending additional occupation forces to Japan. So how did the United States of America respond? Well, the answer is simply by recognizing Chiang Kai-shek's government in exile in Taiwan, and remains that way until President Nixon becomes president, and he recognizes for the first time communist China in mainland China. Practice question number 3, how did local, state, and federal governments react to the growth of suburbs that began in the 1950s? By building infrastructure to support urban sprawl, by providing tax incentives to support urban renewal, by creating quality public education systems in inner cities, by developing efficient mass transit systems in inner cities. Well, it didn't have anything to do with inner cities. Inner cities, of course, start to decline, so we can eliminate C and D just based on that. Urban would be city renewal. It can't be that, because that doesn't happen either. The best answer is by building infrastructure to support urban sprawl. In other words, providing road systems and sanitation systems for people that live in the suburbs. This excerpt comes from an official government document issued in 1948. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there should be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. That is from our President of the United States of America, who desegregates the military. From which document does this excerpt come? Majority opinion in Plessy v. Ferguson, majority opinion in Brown versus the Board of Education, C, President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, D, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. Well, it can't be Plessy, that's separate but equal. Brown, of course, outlawed separate but equal, so it can only be one of these two executive orders. Now, during the time that FDR was President of the United States of America, the military was segregated. During the Korean War, when Truman, of course, was president, it was desegregated. And the answer is President Harry Truman, Executive Order 9981. Truman is the first president to desegregate the military. 5, what effect did the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact have on Europe? A, the alliances weakened the European economy. B, the alliances created further divisions within Europe. C, alliances strengthened the economic power across all of Europe. The alliances created more peaceful relationships between European countries. Well, the best answer is going to be B, the alliances created further divisions within Europe, because once again, it was us against them approach. And the United States of America would align itself with any nation that aligned with our interests against the Soviet interests and communism. Practice question number 6. This excerpt is from a resolution drafted during the United Nations Genocide Convention. The resolution was adopted unanimously by the General Assembly of the United Nations, of which the United States is a member nation, on December 9th, 1948. Article 1, the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in the time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Article 6, persons charged with genocide shall be tried by a competent tribunal of state in the territory of which the act was committed, or by such international penal tribunal as may have jurisdiction with respect to those contracting parties which shall have accepted this jurisdiction. Why did the United States agree to adopt this resolution? A, to prevent being pulled into another international war. B, to avoid being involved in the prosecution of international war criminals. C, to avoid being a party to future trials resulting in international conflicts. To prevent attempted destruction of human group from happening again. Well, the best answer is going to be D, to prevent the attempted destruction of a human group from happening again. How did the Korean War affect the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? The Korean War decreased Cold War tensions because troops were removed from the 38th parallel. B, the Korean War increased Cold War tensions because it changed the post-war competition into a military competition that lasted for years. C, the Korean War increased Cold War tensions because it led to the United States and the Soviet Union from a policy of interventionism to isolationism. D, the Korean War decreased Cold War tensions because it led the United States and the Soviet Union to agree that nuclear weapons would never be used. Well, it didn't decrease them, so it had to be something that increased. And the answer, of course, is B, the Korean War increased Cold War tensions because it changed the post-war competition into a military confrontation that lasted for years. Number 8, which statement describes how the Truman Doctrine contributed to the breakdown of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union? A, the Truman Doctrine threatened the Soviet Union by providing military equipment to France and Great Britain. B, the Truman Doctrine threatened the Soviet Union by providing funds to build U.S. Air Force bases in Spain and Italy. C, the Truman Doctrine gave economic aid to Greece and Turkey. Which threatened the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. D, the Truman Doctrine instituted economic sanctions on Poland and Hungary, which threatened the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And the best answer would be C, the Truman Doctrine gave economic aid to any nations, like Greece and Turkey specifically, which threatened the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. All right, those are some of the sample practice questions, of course, that you can access from MDE, and some of the ones that I've created myself. But when you access these questions, go through and take them seriously as you go through and do the very best that you can to answer them based on the information, of course, that you've been provided. And that way, that when you have your benchmark test or when you have your Mississippi, U.S. history assessment that will be given, of course, in the spring, that you'll do quite well. So with that, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online. And once again, we tell you all the time, don't take our word for it. Make sure you do your own research, draw your own conclusions, and with that, we'll see you next time.